branded content, and I know it's been a long day, so I will try and keep it brief and really happy to answer questions at the end. Really quickly about me, I have been doing branded content for a while now, and right now I work for Zoomer, and these are the brands that the team that I run creates branded content for. So you've probably come across something we've made over the years. And so I just kind of want to share with you some of the practices that that I've learned over the years and still use to this day. I guess the question to start with is, what is branded content? And I don't mean it necessarily in the form of a definition of like you might find in a textbook. I think it's more because there's so many terms that are used to describe this field. There's branded content, sponsored content, paid content, native content. Like it's just, there's so many, right? And so, yes, there are some nuances here and there, but generally speaking, it's all the same thing. So for the sake of this presentation, you might hear me say branded content a lot, or I might say sponsored content or paid content, but I'm basically talking about the same stuff. One of the ways that I like to think about it in practice is because I work very closely with our editorial teams, and we're often approached by brands that want to do stuff with us, and we kind of sort of scratch our heads and go, well, is this editorial or is this paid, and how do we approach this? And one of the things that I like to, ask myself is, would we have made this if an advertiser wasn't paying for it? So, so if you're making it only because an advertiser is funding it, either entirely or partially, then it's generally, you could call it paid content. And that's the kind of thing that we use to, at least on our end, to kind of differentiate whether this should be paid or whether this isn't paid, or it's advertorial or editorial. And you're probably wondering, like, why is he talking about editorial a lot? And I will get into that throughout this presentation. A really, really quick history, and I always like relaying this fun fact, but the very, very first sort of instance of branded content that people have identified was all the way back in 1895. John Deere launched a magazine, and they published it for their own customers, and it was all about farming and how to grow stuff. And their target was farmers, clearly. And it had reached 4 million readers by 1912, which is phenomenal. And even today, it's still around. It's called The Furrow, and it still reaches 2 million readers. So, so yeah, this is apparently the first known instance of branded content. And over the years, branded content is so many things, right? It's advertorials, it's product placements, it's sponsored articles, influencer campaigns. You can sponsor social posts, you can sponsor playlists, you can sponsor gaming. There's just so many areas where this lives now. It's hard to avoid it. I do think that, like, I've worked in so many different forms of advertising, and I find this is the hardest. It's the hardest for the publisher. It's the hardest for clients. It's the hardest for the salespeople. So if you're having trouble with it, I get it. And but it is in demand, and if you can make it happen, then you can raise the profile of your publication with advertisers, which is why you want to give this presentation. So for the sake of today, given all of those different tactics, I really just going to talk about articles and social posts. We can get into all kinds of other things later, but let's just keep this, to a small segment, and we'll just talk about these two tactics. So for articles, a branded article can come in a lot of different forms. The way that I like to differentiate different types of branded articles is I like to look at who wrote it. So you could see a branded article could be something the client wrote, and you just publish it as is, like a traditional advertorial. it could be written by your paid team. So you might have a paid writing team or a freelancer who works on exclusively paid content. Or your editorial team could actually write it and the client has no say in the content. And so there are lots of ways that you can create branded articles. The key to all of these is disclosure. So disclosure is really important. It's letting the world know that this was something that is paid for. And there are actually different types of disclosures out there. And one of the practices that we use is we'll modify the disclosure depending on who creates the content. So some of the examples we use is to say, this content was created by Hive Labs in partnership with a client. Hive Labs is our internal content team. You could say this content was provided by one of our advertisers and Daily Hive was not involved in the creation of this content. Or we have one where we could say this content was created by Daily Hive's editorial team independently with financial support from a brand. So that one would be like the brand is asking us to write articles about great places to, great parks to have a barbecue this summer, and it's a beer brand. So they just want to be attached to that kind of content. And they might have ads around the content, but they had no say in the actual content itself. So that is another form of branded content, and we would disclose that accordingly. Moving on to social posts, and social posts, once again, can come in many different forms. There's Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, Twitter. I still call it Twitter. I'm never going to call it X. I think that's silly. Just a terrible name for something. But so Twitter it is. You can basically create posts on all these platforms and have brands pay for that. So you can do sponsored Facebook posts, Facebook stories, Instagram posts, Instagram stories, Instagram reels. We run a lot of contests on Instagram. There's TikTok videos, LinkedIn posts, tweets. All of them can be sponsored, and all of these different platforms have tools in place to facilitate this. The trickiest part with social posts is all of these platforms have different rules, and trying to stay on top of all these different rules can be challenging because they will sometimes change their rules or change their policies, and they don't tell you when they change the policies. And one day you're caught off guard breaking a policy you didn't know you were breaking, or you thought you couldn't do something when actually you can't. And the consequences of breaking policies is not good, because if you're flagged, your account can be, suspended. The posts that you promised the client you'd run won't run. All kinds of havoc can ensue. And I don't know if anyone here has had to deal with any of these companies. When you have your account trouble, it's hell. So I, definitely try my best to make sure we're following these policies. But for example, like just one off the top of my head is alcohol advertising is a no-go on TikTok. So TikTok absolutely forbids anything to do with alcohol. You can't show a drink, you can't mention drinking, you can't do anything. So whereas Facebook, no problem. So it's just those little things that can catch you. And if you're selling this stuff, you want to sell as much as possible. So it's really common for us to sell to a brand as many platforms as possible. To say, hey, if you're coming to us to advertise on Facebook, you should buy TikTok as well. You should buy Instagram as well. Try and sell it all. But then those rules get in the way. So these are all the little things to just remember. But at the end of the day, it can be lucrative. So looking at going back to disclosure, Facebook, for example, has those tools built in. So this image here is from a video we shot with a tourism board on Vancouver Island. And you can see where it says Daily Hive Vancouver and Cowichan Tourism. That's where we've tagged Cowichan Tourism. It's paid partnership. That's all built into Facebook. And so as long as we leverage those, then we're good. Some brands might ask us to do more, hashtag ad, hashtag sponsored. We try not to do that. We like to do the bare minimum, because the more you promote something as being sponsored, there's a chance the less people are going to want to review it. It can get sticky with American advertisers. The FTC in the US, they're more strict about this than we are in Canada. So, so some American brands are really nervous, and they will really impose more disclosure on advertising. Also, I find banks are pretty rigid about this stuff. Financial institutions, any advertiser you're working with where there's a large lawyer department behind the scenes, those are the things to think about. But yeah, and then just the reason why Facebook does this, they'll say it's because we want to make sure our users know what's sponsored and what's not, and I get that, but it also gives them another revenue opportunity, because once the brand is tagged in the post, the brand can put dollars behind it and boost that post, even though it's on our channel. So then you get into the idea of they're paying the money to Facebook. Maybe they should be paying it to us to protect our brand and our revenues. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. I can talk about this forever. But yeah, this is a big world out there, and if you're not doing it now, I recommend you get into it. Moving on. Okay, so if we're talking articles and social posts, and then now we're getting into the idea, well, how do I sell this? And like I said, it's difficult to sell. It's difficult to understand. One of the main things that I would say when you're selling branded content is to remember what it's ideal for. So branded content as a marketing tactic, generally speaking, is very top of funnel. So if you think of the marketing funnel, and at the very top are where you're just in this awareness building stage of your brand, and at the very bottom, you've narrowed it down to people with, basically they're ready to buy. And so marketing, so this is a high funnel tactic. So it's really good for building awareness, generating SEO. It's not impacted by ad blockers. An article can give you lots of opportunity to write about something in detail, educate people on your business. Instagram posts are great. If you're a small business bakery and you make these beautiful cakes, and you just want to get those out there for people to see them. Maybe they're not buying a cake that day, but you're just building awareness of what you're doing. Instagram is, great for that. So it's very much awareness building. And this is where I've found over the years, managing your client expectations is really important, because if you don't understand that, and you are expecting to buy branded content and then the next day generate a bunch of sales, it may not necessarily do that for you. And if you are a small business who's investing $2,000 or $3,000 into a advertising campaign, and for you that's a lot of money, and you're expecting a windfall out of it, and it doesn't show up, then you would be angry. And so managing the expectations with your clients is really important. It's finding out what is it they're actually looking for, and making sure that what you're selling them will actually align with their expectations. We do run into this a fair bit, as we do work with smaller advertisers, and find that oftentimes they don't always realize what branded content is good for. So that's just a little tip and advice to avoid some grief. There's, generally speaking, two ways of pricing branded content. One is a flat fee. The flat fee model is where I just charge you one price, and I will make the content or receive your content and publish it, and that's it. Job done. There's no minimum audience numbers, page views, anything like that provided. And it's a very easy way of doing this. I sort of think of the older days when most people who sold advertising, that's all they did. They just put it up on a billboard and job done. And I unfortunately missed that generation. And in the digital generation, everything has to be, run, monitored, optimized, reported on. Like, it just never ends. So yes, the flat fee model has existed, but most publishers are going to do some kind of guaranteed performance. That's mostly what advertisers look for. That's when I would charge you not only to do everything in flat fee, but I'm also going to promise you a minimum number of something. And that takes risk off the client and puts the risk on the publisher, which is fine. You just have to make sure you can deliver on it. So if I promise you that your article is going to generate so many page views and then the article doesn't, then you would have to give the client back some kind of prorated credit or refund. So that's the trade-off to keep in mind. But guaranteed performance is generally what will be more appealing to people who you're selling to. When you're delivering guaranteed performance, you just have to, there's basically two ways of doing it. One is through your organic traffic. So you just run it until it hits it. You can always leverage different traffic drivers however you want to achieve those goals, like put it in newsletters, run ads on your site, anything that doesn't really cost you anything, you can use to do it. One thing to remember though with this is there's generally a campaign end date. So the advertiser will tell you when they're advertising when they want to be out of market. And that just because the sale is over, or the product won't be available, or the ski hill will be closed because it's spring. So you have to make sure you can deliver before that deadline, because we run into this a lot with holidays. So it's Valentine's Day, and clients really want to run content leading up to Valentine's Day. Gift guides for presents for your partner, or date night ideas, whatever it is. After Valentine's Day, no one's going to read that. So we have to make sure that we can deliver before Valentine's Day. So it's important your salespeople are giving you enough time. The other way is through paid amplification. That's where once the content's live, you would actually pay money through social media or other ad networks to drive more traffic to that content than what you can deliver organically. This is really common. You just have to make sure that when you do that, you build the cost of that into your selling price, because that's a cost that you will incur, not to your client. And so, you don't want to be at a net loss because you didn't factor that in. Paid amplification is good because you can deliver stuff so much faster. So if you do have to deliver before Valentine's Day and it's a week away and you're worried you can't do it organically, then usually throw a little bit of money behind it and you can get there. Just a few other tips is this idea for advertisers. They generally will analyze what they're paying for media and what they're paying for production. Because branded content requires production on your end, there's a cost and there's a value to that you want to make sure you're being compensated for. And it's not that advertisers won't pay for it, but especially if it's a media buying agency, they want to demonstrate their value to their clients by maximizing the amount of media they're getting. And they don't want to necessarily put a big chunk of money just towards production. So it is common for publishers or media companies to throw in the production for free. We don't do that because creating articles and stuff is labor intensive. So we do charge for that. But the general rule is like 75-25 in terms of, so 25% of the budget would be towards production. You might be able to push it to 33, but it's just something to keep in mind. And then the last tip here is just around terms and conditions. So your contracts with your clients, some of the things to make sure you include are going to be cancellation policies, Cancellation policies are important because if you've invested a bunch of hours writing something and then they cancel on you, you want to make sure you're compensated for what you've invested into it. So there's that. There's usage rights and licensing because they're sending you assets or you're creating assets for them. So this is something that happens. We'll have a client that will send us an image for their campaign, and we run that image, and 2 years later, some lawyer reaches out because the image that we ran, the client didn't have the rights to give us, and the photographer is now demanding a payment. Like all this stuff happens. So make sure you're covered. Confidentiality is pretty standard. Indemnification, liability caps, all that stuff. If you're dealing with U.S. advertisers, U.S. advertisers will often make you sign their contracts. And if you're signing an advertiser's contract, the number one thing to look for is something called sequential liability, which basically means if the agency doesn't get paid by their client, then the agency doesn't have to pay you. So if you're the publisher, that's bad. You don't want that. So strike that term out and replace it with something else so that at the end of the day, your interests are covered. So anyway, that's just some terms and conditions stuff. Okay, we're moving on here. So how do you make it? So now you've sold it and now you need to make it. This is probably the most challenging thing of branded content is this struggle of preserving your brand versus preserving your sanity. And what I mean by that is the branded content is meant to look and sound like your publication. And the easiest way I can explain that is it was your voice and your brand that motivated an advertiser to come to want to pay you money in the first place. That's what's brought the audience to you and made you successful. So if you're creating content for that brand, logic would say that if I can create that content in my own voice, then that will be more successful because that's what my readers are looking for. And I believe that. I think that's 100% true. Advertisers have a hard time sometimes with that because they see it as advertising they're paying for. And so they often really want it to sound like them. And that's where you kind of get into this back and forth struggle with clients of trying to convince them that it should sound like you and not them, and it'll perform better and this and that and what have you. So I don't have a solution for this. This is just something that happens. And I've been doing this now for a long time, and even it still happens today, right? This is where sometimes it is advantageous to just have the client write it and give it to you and you publish it. Makes them happy, saves you a lot of grief. And so I can see a role for that in this whole ecosystem. Large corporations that are so particular, or government who are also so particular, that might be better for them. But generally speaking, you don't want it to sound like advertising. You want it to sound like your own content, and you want it to sound like you, and it generally does have a better result. And this is where I recommend having some written guidelines and specs. So anything that you can provide to your clients that show them like, hey, like this is the word count we keep to. These are our style guides. These are our image requirements. No, we won't run a black and white image. It has to be color. Maybe you want some policies around political content, whether or not you want to accept that type of content or not. So those are all things that having them written down is good, because if you're trying to explain to a client why they can't do something, showing them a policy can sometimes be more effective than just trying to explain it to them. So when you get into the production process, having a structured process helps. It helps manage the client's expectations. It keeps your project on track, and you just want to avoid the lengthy back and forth revisions. I recommend having someone who is like a dedicated project manager. It doesn't have to be someone you hire. It could be anyone on your team that is responsible for going back and forth with the client. Ideally, not the salesperson. And I only say this because there's a bit of a conflict of interest in that a salesperson really wants to say yes because they want the client who's paid money to be happy and they're making commission. And then you've got a team that's trying to maintain the integrity of a brand and your publication. So separating those roles is a good idea. And then that way, you try and balance both. Clients should fill out creative brief. Creative brief gives you the information that you need before you get started. They should approve a concept before you actually start writing anything. There's nothing worse than writing 700 words and they're like, it's not what I had in mind. I like to force clients to provide all feedback in writing. That means tracking changes, putting comments, whatever it is. What this does is it holds them accountable for the feedback they're giving you, and it forces them to think about it, because it's really easy for a client to just jump on a call with you. I just want to jump on a call and give you my feedback over the phone. And then they're going to give you very vague, it needs more pizzazz. Can you make it more spunky? And no one can work with that. Whereas you need like specific feedback. So making it in writing where someone actually has to track changes forces the brain to think that way. And it also makes them accountable a little bit. If you've gone through 10 revisions and someone's still not happy, you can go back to the written records, if you will. And always, it's just a general rule that if it's something that's paid, it should always be approved by them before you publish it, unless it's that editorial content that I mentioned earlier, which they don't get any say in. I have a bit of a hot take here, and that is just, when branded content came around first, there is a real strong need for it to be separated from editorial and paid, and I still believe that's true. But I think we're at a stage now where having necessarily like separate teams to create that is not always necessary. If you're in a news gathering type organization, then yeah, absolutely. You don't want to mix news writers or news content with the paid world. That's just a disaster. But for example, in our case with our video content, we don't have a separate video team that does the paid content and a separate video team that does our non-paid content, because we're just lifestyle. Almost all of our content is lifestyle, and we don't want to get to a point where someone sees a person and right away goes, oh, this is a paid thing, and I don't really want to watch it. So we when it comes to lifestyle content, our video crew is one and the same, but certainly our newsrooms, whether it's at blogTO or Daily Hive, are all kept completely separate. But for me to do my job effectively, I have a really good relationship with our editor-in-chief. We collaborate all the time. She understands the need for paid content. I understand how editorial works, and we work hand in hand with this stuff. So I think that's why we're fairly successful at it. Okay, and then just to wrap up here with how to measure it. So as I mentioned, you are going to have to provide some kind of metrics to your clients. Some of the more popular metrics for articles would be page views, reading time, link clicks, page scroll percentage, geography, traffic sources. These are metrics that you can pull from different places. The most common, even if you have just straight Google Analytics, you can generally pull a lot of this stuff. On the social side, they all report to you various things: impressions, reach, number of comments, number of reactions, number of shares, the views, the plays, all these things. So you're going to want to compile this into a report for your client. And the good news is there are tools to make this easier, because this is a lot of manual work. And so we use a tool on our end that's called Momently, which is such a time saver. So what it basically does is, you know, all the different APIs from Facebook and TikTok and everything else just plug into this thing, along with Google Analytics or whatever else you're using. And then when you're compiling a report for a client, you just click, 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 click on the different things, and it just pulls it into a report, into a dashboard, and then you just send that to the client. It's a huge time saver. So if you're only selling one thing to a client, one article, one social post, then, or you're just ramping up, then maybe this isn't a necessity. But when you do get to a point where you might be doing 2 or more campaigns a month and they're buying different places, then I would recommend something like this. And they're not that expensive, and they're wonderful. So there are different options out there, but this can be a huge time saver for you as well in this space.
Thanks, Neil. That was really helpful. Thank you so much for joining us. There is going to be questions. I have questions. I
Sure.
always have questions. You know me. And I hope that as this sinks in, our guests will come forward. So we've got lots of them here. So I'll start. I'll start with Wanda's question. How did Facebook blocking news sharing affect your company?
Yeah, good question. And it definitely affected our company for sure. So because our sites are classified as news, when C18 came in, we did lose that just daily organic traffic, not just to paid content, but to our editorial content as well. And just like everybody else in this industry, we had to pivot. We just really had no choice. So we focused on newsletters as a way to regain more audience back to our sites. On the social media side, there's been a lot more focus on TikTok, and creating video content for clients. The one thing that Facebook didn't shut off is the ability to put money behind posts and
No, no
pay for
surprise.
appearance. Yeah, so so we do leverage that as well quite a bit. Um, yeah, there is no question that we saw a drop off like everyone else did, uh, and for the record, we were never in favor of this legislation, and it was disappointing to see it, but it was industry wide, and so um, we just sort of sit back and hope maybe that this will one day sort itself out. But yeah, it was just we just had no choice. We had to pivot and look at other ways to bring that traffic back to our site. One thing that we do know is, the people who visit your site through these other means other than social, um, they're generally your most loyal readers.
Mm.
Um, it's easy to be scrolling feeds and seeing an article and clicking on it, reading that article, and then just bouncing back to your feeds. But if you're brought to a site through another channel, your time on site might be longer, your engagement with the site would be longer. So while overall traffic numbers may have gone down, the actual engagement of the traffic you have does generally go up.
Okay. We have a question from Glenn Alderson at Range. And before I ask the question, I'm going to mention that right before we came into this meeting, I got a beautiful newsletter from Gravity Pope that is all about a partnership, a content partnership promoting shoes and music and lifestyle. And it's really well done, Glenn. So I'll ask his question. Do you have an example of a report and the metrics you included to report a successful campaign to a client?
Yes, I don't have an example with me at the moment, but I can certainly speak to it. And it would depend, first off, on what the campaign consisted of. So
Mhm.
if it was an article, for example, then the main metrics you're going to report to a client are going to be how many people viewed that article, what was the average time they spent reading that article, how many people clicked on links within that article, which generally go back to a client's website. Um, the geography of where those readers came from is also important. You could also report on how readers found that article, whether it was through social media, search, direct traffic, paid networks. Um, those are generally the major categories that you would want to report on. And then another thing clients will ask you is some kind of comparative figure. So it's one thing to say your article did X. They might want to know, how does that compare? So you could offer them to say, well, based on the average of all of our articles, this is how you did. You could look at an industry benchmark. So the company I used to work with, Pressboard, every year publishes an annual industry benchmark of sponsored content. So you could look at something like that. Um, Benchmarks are a bit of a blessing and a curse. I struggle with them because everybody wants a benchmark, but then when something doesn't hit a benchmark, they want to know why, and it can be, viewed as a failure, which it really isn't, because everything's so different. Maybe your reading time was not super high, but your clicks was amazing. So, it's one thing to send the reports. That's a whole other world of explaining the report and what it means. On the social media side, we look mostly at impressions, views of just a video, the number of engagements, so reactions, shares, comments. Those are all the key things that clients are going to look for in your reporting. And it can be like, there are still, I'm sure, organizations out there that just manually compile information, put it in a Google sheet, and send it off. I like to suggest, like, if it's a paying client and they're giving you money, creating something that's visual, that looks nice, is a good thing to do. But that's time consuming. So that's where I like the tool that we use, because it just displays everything in a very visually, aesthetically pleasing way. It's a live dashboard. Clients can check on it every day if they wanted to. It's really cool. And when you do give your report to the client, think of it as that's your pitch to renew. So, like, it's basically, that report is, you're already selling them to try and come back and buy another campaign.
Yeah. I think you made me think of a conversation I had with another publisher about this type of content too, and and this relates to some of our smaller publishers here, because you can do this even though you're not a big general interest network of sites like Daily Hive. If you have a niche audience and you can deliver an engaged niche audience, and the example she gave was an electric car client. They're not looking for 10,000 reads. They're looking for 30 people who want to buy an electric car to read it, right? And if you can deliver that audience, then you've won that client. And some of us can do that. Well, hopefully all of us can do that. So there's some more questions. Sylvia asks, do you recommend putting a limit on revisions? If you do, what do you find is a reasonable number of revisions? I think this also goes to your, like, just sometimes just let them, we've had, just let them have it. It is just not worth it.
It's not worth it. Indeed. So the recommended number, I think, is reasonable, would be two revisions, right? You get a first look, and then you can, tear it apart if you'd like to. And then the hope is you provide the revised version, and then now you're more in a minor revision stage. That's kind of the best case. Um, in practice, though, it's like 3, 4 revisions. It's a tough one because you can put a number of revisions in a thing and say you get max 2, But if you get to 2 revisions and there's clients still not pleased with it, what do you do? Do you just like cancel it? Do you charge more? But charging more after signing a contract is never easy. Um, do you so what ends up happening is you just go with it. You just say, okay, we just kind of need to keep this, get this, make them happy is really what it comes down to. Um, and so it's one of those things where you can put a number in there and hope for the best, but don't be surprised if you don't keep to that number. Um, this is where I think you want to look at your entire process and make sure that your entire process works really well, so that when you do get to that revision stage, you're in good shape. So one of the tips, for example, is don't write the draft until they approve the concept and the direction that you're going to write.
Hmm.
um, so stuff like that helps you mitigate any potential trouble down the road.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Another question from Glenn. When paying to boost sponsored content, do you find Meta or Google Ads are more effective in driving traffic results? And are there other avenues you'd use?
Yeah, I prefer Meta over Google. Google Google's great for search, um, and but its cost per click can vary quite a bit depending on how competitive the category is that you are um, bidding for. And I also find that it's search driven. So if you're trying to get a large number of people in a short amount of time, it's not going to be the best. Meta, on the other hand, will let you set all those parameters as far as how much traffic you're looking for, and how much you want to spend, and its reach is gigantic. And then you can set geography and all the other parameters that you need to. So yes, between the two, I prefer Meta. And honestly, in all the years, I have yet to find something that I like better than Meta. It just, this is one thing it does really well, is allowing companies like ours to find traffic to paid traffic to our content.
Yeah. I feel at this point like I am torturing you, so I'm just going to ask you one more question. And on behalf of all of the publishers here, how do we find out about the RFPs? I mean, how do we get more of this business and become more visible to agencies and PR companies and even the press boards and the other networks of the world?
Yeah, good question. There are there isn't like a centralized platform where all the bids go in, unfortunately. It really is about knocking on doors and getting in front of potential buyers and advertisers. Um, and it's hard because they get approached all day long by so many different publications and networks and everything under the sun. So don't be discouraged if you're trying and it's not working. Um, the thing to keep in mind, and I think maybe this is um, could be good advice here, is like there's a lot of niche publications that are within this group, and and that could, well, I'm gonna just go out there and say it, that I don't know how many advertisers actually know you exist. Like there are if you're thinking about where I advertise, um, there's going to be lots of places that come to mind that are going to be top of mind, and they're not always going to be thinking of those little niche ones. But you just want to get in front of them so that one day, if there's an advertiser that's looking to reach school teachers, they might think of that. Oh, there's that publication that does this. Or if they're looking to reach people who love bird watching. Oh, great. Hey, there's that magazine out there that does this. So it's kind of like getting in front of the advertisers, just making sure they know you exist, making sure they have your information, making sure they have your what your niche is. And it's not necessarily going to be something that you see a return on right away. But you just want to be there when they do get that client that comes along. That's the perfect fit for you. Um, Another place to look might then just be like those small businesses and those direct. So I mean, I work a lot with agencies, so my brain is often thinking of agencies, but um, working with brands directly or businesses directly. So um, it might just be as simple as like walking through the mall and walking into businesses and introducing yourself and leaving a business card and saying, hey, I run this publication, and your my audience would be really interested in your service or your product. If you ever want to talk, let us know. Though that is it's really like there's nothing high tech about this. It's just there's no AI to solve this one, unfortunately. You just have to
Yeah.
get out there and pound the pavement.